Welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. The topic for today is Joe Henderson's Multiple. Now, I posted about this album on January 7th on Instagram, and in that post, where I talked a little bit about the music as well as the fact that this has never had a reissue, criminally so, I concluded that post with paging Jazz Dispensary. Like, hey, Jazz Dispensary, pay attention here kind of thing. Well, guess what? Just a week later, Jazz Dispensary responded to my post saying they received the call, news coming tomorrow. Now, obviously, this was all purely coincidental, but I did not have any knowledge of this being, possibly reissued by that label. In fact, I'm quite sure it was like a year in development, but it's a funny coincidence, right? And that album, again, is the topic for today. So you can probably already guess that I'm a fan. And I'm going to go on record now and say that this is my favorite album that Jazz Dispensary has tackled yet. But of course, how does this reissue sound, especially considering that it's the first vinyl reissue ever? Well, before I get into it, as always, please do consider subscribing to my channel. And of course, you can follow me on Instagram. My handle is what_can_brown. So before we talk about Multiple specifically, let's talk about Joe Henderson specifically. So Joe Henderson is a familiar musician to many of us jazz fans, tenor player mostly, I would say, from Detroit. Okay, I think technically he's from Ohio, but I would say he probably identifies as being a Detroit musician. His very first session was with Kenny Dorham, and that was Una Mas for Blue Note in 1963. Now, supposedly, there's a tape privately owned somewhere that features Joe Henderson playing with like Roy Brooks and Sonny Red and Hank Mobley and Joe Brazil in Joe Brazil's basement. But if we're talking about, because I don't even think that's on YouTube, if we're talking about stuff that everyone can hear, Una Mas is the very first album that he recorded on. He then performed on Am I Blue by Grant Green, which was recorded just about a month later. And his third session was his very first as a leader, and that was the absolute classic Page 1. Now, really each of these Blue Note sessions and his Blue Note work generally, I would say are classics. But what we're talking about today is sort of his next evolution, and that was his time with the Milestone label. I think he actually recorded something like 9 or 10 albums for that label, and they're arguably as good as anything that he did for Blue Note. Very sort of different style, more modern for the time period, I would say. By the time that Multiple was recorded, he had already put out Tetragon, he put out Power to the People. He put out Talia Al Dowd for the Impulse label, but other Milestone recordings were like In Japan, In Pursuit of Blackness, Black is the Color. So this was after that music that Multiple was put out. So again, 1973. And if I'm thinking about the lineup on this record, I would say it's mostly the following musicians. It's Jack DeJohnette on drums. It's Larry Willis on like electric piano as well as synthesizer, Dave Holland on bass, and Arthur Jenkins on congas and percussion. And that's sort of the core. I will say that we also have James Blood Ulmer on guitar as well as John Thomas on guitar, each of them just on a single track. And it is worth noting that Joe Henderson doesn't just play tenor here. He also plays flute, soprano, percussion, and he sings or sort of vocalizes on several tracks. And incidentally, as with a number of these albums for Milestone, the producer is Orrin Keepnews, who I think many of us know him from Riverside, but he sort of meandered his way over to Milestone before I think later ending up at Fantasy. So as I mentioned, this release by Jazz Dispensary is the very first reissue. And it was actually, I say it was the first reissue. When it was released in 1973, it was released simultaneously in several countries, but all of those I would say are first pressings in their respective countries, and it hasn't had a reissue on vinyl in any country since 1973. If you did want to get a physical copy of this, otherwise it would have to be a CD version. I do know that OJC tackled it sometime in the early 90s, which was a digital remaster by Phil Delancey. All right, so now about this Jazz Dispensary release. If you follow this channel, you probably know who they are. If you don't follow this channel, then follow it, and I'll tell you just a little bit about it. So Jazz Dispensary is a subsidiary of Craft Recordings, which itself is a subsidiary of Concord. Maybe I'm using the term subsidiary incorrectly. Maybe I should say sublabel, but you get the idea. So their release of Multiple here is in what they call their top shelf series. It does feature an all analog treatment with lacquers cut by Kevin Gray. It's on 180 gram vinyl, and it does have a tip-on jacket. These things in and of themselves may not mean very much, but the fact that Craft and Jazz Dispensary consistently use this sort of process and these people for the recordings, and their output sounds as great as it does, we have to start to wonder, is it because of some of these things? Okay, maybe like the tip-on jacket's not going to like affect the quality of the sound, but it is a quality cover. Okay, so typically I would say with this outfit we don't have to worry about quality, and we come to expect that it's at least going to sound as great as it possibly can. And I say that in case there are any constraints, right? Constraints with the source material, perhaps. In this case with Multiple, I don't think that there are any constraints, at least none that I can hear. It's clear that the source content was in great shape because simply the album sounds phenomenal. So otherwise, so check this out. So I do have an original, which is what I posted when I posted on Instagram. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I frequently do. This is my original cover. You can see it's yellowed because of age. But otherwise, it's the same thing. I know a lot of people care about how well they represent the original, right? So, it is the same. Obviously, Craft continues to use their own catalog number. But fortunately, for these milestone records, it's quite small up there in the corner. And the back looks exactly the same. Now, perhaps it doesn't have quite the same texture, but because this is like slightly different texture, but it is what it is. And I think they did a great job representing the actual cover image. Incidentally, my vinyl arrived flat, no issues, no non-fill. Didn't have any issues really at all. No noise going, at the lead-in nor in the run-out. So all of that aside, and I like to mention that stuff because I know that there are people who care about it. I don't think I care about it quite as much. It's more of like cherry on top, right? But I frequently like to talk about, or maybe put more emphasis on the music. Before I talk about individual tracks, what sounds great about this album? Well, I think in a nutshell, it's the stereo separation, it's the bass, it's the dynamics, it's the clarity of the music. This is really one of those albums where you can sit back and forget about the actual medium entirely because there's no issues. It's just clear, beautiful music. All right, so it's easy to cover the tracks when there's only 5 of them, but I will do it briefly. So track 1 is something called Tres Candeo La, and to me, and in fact, is this a Henderson original? It is. This one is very Miles Davis in sound, at least to me. It sort of has I would call it an On the Corner feel, if you're familiar with that album by Miles Davis. And I think what stands out to me most here is Henderson has a very sort of organic sound to his horn because he is not, it's not like manipulated in any way. There's no echo, but he plays against or, with a rhythm section that is very spacey, sort of celestial sounding, kind of funky in a way that does incorporate a lot of effects. And there's also this kind of layering of tracks that give it that sound. So it has a complexity to it, but it is not as far out as what is like a Miles Davis electric album. One of the interesting things though is that despite the fact that there's a very organic sound to Henderson, towards the end of the track, he actually accompanies himself on flute, which is kind of just like super interesting because you realize that there's only one musician there, and so obviously there's a layering of tracks. But I absolutely love the opener. The second track is actually my favorite on the entire album, and it is called Boita. I think that's how you pronounce it. And if there's standout elements to this, I think this is, I mentioned earlier, I really like the stereo sort of separation here. I just think it works really well, both like on the original recording as well as the reissue. But the stereo effect here, I think, is absolutely amazing as a listener to just kind of like sit back and process because it is so beautiful. It's really great sort of percussion and maybe even chimes or something or bells in the left channel with electric piano, this sort of almost ethereal sounding electric piano in the right channel. And it just really sets a mood. This is my favorite track, like I said, on the whole album, and great that it's over 10 minutes. In fact, these first two tracks are both over 10 minutes, and I would say that they're my favorite on the album. And that actually takes us through the first side. So the second side, a little bit different, but many of the same elements. I would say this is a very cohesive album. You're not going to hear a lot of completely different styles on it, but instead I think it's almost like who is the, I don't know, like in some ways different musicians almost take a leading role, or like, maybe on one it's Henderson and the other it's a rhythm section kind of thing. So track one on side two is called Song for Sinners, and this one has a modal feel, kind of a pulsing hypnotic thing that I think is really nice. Henderson does kind of chant over it, and I didn't mention actually on track one he also vocalizes on that. But Song for Sinners is probably one of the least structured pieces on this album, but it's still absolutely fantastic. Let's see, Turned Around is what comes next. This one is kind of interesting because it has a sort of a funk feel, and I would probably say it's one of the most straight ahead in sound on the album, but it's also still modal. So I know you're kind of wondering, like, wait, how is it funk and it's modal? But you sort of have to hear it because it does accomplish both of those things. And then the final track, it's titled Me Among Others. This is, I think this is one of the shortest ones. And to me, this is a little bit more, again, of that sort of Miles sound a little bit. I hesitate to say that because I do think that this is a innovative album that stands on its own. I'm just trying to like explain it within the context maybe of something that you might have, you might have heard if you haven't already heard multiple. And that's how I'd describe it. It's, maybe it's the weakest track on the album. Honestly, like it doesn't have as much of a character to, at least to me, and it kind of replicates some of the sounds that I've heard on some of the other tracks. But I think it's a fitting bookend to the album in terms of tying things together, even if it's not really offering that much brand new. I don't know. Maybe that's like not fair. I really love this album. I love every track, and like I think I said up front, it kind of like twists some of the elements from track to track. I mean, overall, this is very post-bop. Overall, there are spiritual elements. There is funk here, and there is vocalizing, but not like outright, lyrics. It's not that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of the rundown of each of the tracks on the album. And so of course, the question then becomes, now that you've heard about the music and you've heard a little bit about at least what I think of how this reissue sounds, I suppose the question is, what's up with this original pressing? So I will keep it brief because I think a lot of folks are more interested in how the new reissue sounds and maybe a little bit less in sort of hard to find, at least in decent condition, originals, right? So what I would say about this original pressing that, by the way, I basically have only owned for 2 months or whatever before I was able to get my copy in of this reissue, which is just kind of like odd timing because I've been looking for a copy for so long. What I would say about the original in comparison is that it sounds to me like it's more treble forward. If that makes sense. The bass is less pronounced and the sort of higher treble instruments, if you will. And I guess what I mean by that is like, the tenor, it's the vocals. Those pop a little bit more on the original compared to the other instruments. It's not that it pops more necessarily compared to the reissue, but more compared to the other instruments, with bass less pronounced. I will say that I didn't hear as much interest or like there wasn't as much detail around the drums. Like there was a thinner sound to the percussion overall. And I think that there's less separation or like distinction between the instruments as well. So in a way, it's like, yes, it's blended, but maybe a little bit too much, because you don't get a sense of, like, in a great stereo separation where you can kind of like pick out instruments and they're very distinct and you can hear them almost independently of the other musicians, even though there's only two speakers. And you could have like five musicians or seven musicians and you can still hear like very distinctly individuals rather than things getting layered. And you don't really get that on the original. There's more of a blend to it rather than getting that distinction. And I would say, therefore, that the blend of these, especially, it's like the amplified instruments almost versus the acoustic ones, like that blend isn't probably as precise as it could be. Now, how would I know what it could be unless we've heard the reissue and I've heard how it sounds there, right? And I do think that there is much better separation of the instruments, and that it simply sounds better. If I was going to defend the original at all, I would say that this is going to sound weird, that there's a really nice vintage sound to the original. And maybe vintage isn't the right word. You know what it is there's like a 70s sound to it that is more pronounced than on the original. And I mean that in a really endearing way. You know what it is? It's like, it's the layering of flute and tenor that kind of like do these accents on the opening track. It's the tone of the vocals on the opening track. And I'm using that, maybe just that track is just an example, but there is a charm, I think, to how these old records sound. And I don't think that anybody could argue, I'm sure people can, but like I would never say that the reissue, or excuse me, that the original sounds better than the reissue in this particular case. And yet, when I listen to that original, I'm like, wow, there's still some really nice charm here that it's kind of hard to replicate. And obviously, I could do away with the pops, and like, yes, I acknowledge that like objectively, or I mean, everything's subjective, but you know what I mean. Like the reissue sounds better, but there's still a charm, and I don't know. Maybe I can't separate the idea that like I know it's an original pressing, and so therefore I'm like conditioned to ensure that it sounds good in my mind. I think I'm aware of that bias, and I still think there's something to the original, but the high level here is that I don't think anybody will be disappointed with this reissue. I think it does a fantastic job, in some ways better, of representing the music, as Jazz Dispensary oftentimes does, and I think that this is such a well thought out release. In terms of its choice, right? Like, not only hasn't it had a reissue, but it was recorded just so dang well. Like, you can tell when you hear the reissue and you can hear how well it sounds, you can tell that recording at the time in 1973 was done very, very well. They're just able to pull out, all the magic from that original tape. And like I said in my intro, I think this is my favorite release that Jazz Dispensary has done, and that's a strong statement. Like, they've put out a number of phenomenal albums, but obviously there's the newness of this one, but I think even aside from that, like, ask me again in a year and I'll probably say the same thing. We'll see.